Well, good morning again, everyone. Thank you to everybody who's taken part in this service. Ellen with the poem, and Tracy, thank you for doing that letter, and Joanne for the work you've done, and of course all the musicians, and Catherine and Oliver for telling that really wonderful story that I'd never heard before. And let me just mention, Jim, thank you very much for your absolute patience as I was trying to deal with time issues, getting the service ready, et cetera, et cetera. Thank you very much, Jim. Appreciate it. And I'm really glad to be here today. And by the way, if I missed anyone who was important in putting this service together, thank you also. I should also add, whoever is doing the tech work for doing these services is wonderful. Thank you. So this morning, I'm going to talk about addiction and recovery. I'm going to talk about from three angles. One is my personal story. Secondly, somewhat the resources that are available these days, and some of that we can talk about in the circle afterwards. And then this little thorny issue of what Jim talked about as higher power, because I know that that can be a stumbling block for many of us, not just UUs, but many people in recovery. So just to let you know, I grew up on a farm in Maine, and I was home taught until high school. And I never heard anything about addiction because we weren't really connected to a lot of people. And really, no one talked about it because it was a moral flaw. It was a failing. Anyone who was addicted simply didn't have it together, or they were morally suspect. So I never heard about it. I didn't even know that the last several generations of males in my family of origin were all alcoholics, every single one of them. And as I said, in those days, we didn't talk about addiction. And of course, there was tobacco and alcohol, and later meth, opiates. For me, it was oftentimes food, especially chocolate donuts covered in coconut. I could never resist them. I still can't. And then more recently, in terms of addiction, the internet, totally connected, and to the point where it's still an addiction for me, one that I can't give up. But as I started drinking in my late teens, and I didn't really pay much attention to it in my 20s. I was going through lots of dramas and heartaches in the 20s, as I'm sure many of us do. But eventually, in my 30s, I realized I had to get sober because it was killing me. In July of 1984, I lived in Berkeley, California, and I got up and I decided to go to the AA fellowship there. And that's where I started sobriety. I did not like the religious language of AA, and I still don't, but the people and the stories saved my life. I could listen to a person's story across the room, and I could say, that's my story. And I'm working with that story to learn how to recover from alcoholism. Those people and those stories saved my life, as I said. Unfortunately, by 1994, I returned to drinking during and after a failed marriage and ministry. I took a time out and I decided to work at a Buddhist retreat center in Southwest Washington State, because I was living in Oregon at the time. And I went there because I'd always been interested in Buddhism, in its teachings. But my interest was here in the head. It wasn't here in the heart. It wasn't the practice, say, of meditation or the precepts, which I'll talk about in a minute. So I went to this retreat center, and I was there for about 1.5 years, still drinking. And later, I met my 2 old Zen teachers, Chosen and Hogan Bays, and I asked them if I could come to their monastery, which which is now called Great Vows and Monastery, again in Oregon. And they said, yes, that would be fine. I did not, because I was afraid to, I did not tell them about my alcoholism. Eventually, and this was about 1999, I became Buddhist, and that's really not a good term. I took the training precepts of how to live my life in a more ethical and moral way. And the only one that was really a trouble for me was the fifth precept about not getting intoxicated. And that was one that the Buddha talked about a great deal 2,600 years ago, because addiction, alcohol, and so on was very prevalent in his culture. So it's the reason it's one of the 5 primary precepts. But I still went to AA meetings, but I couldn't find one that I liked because of all the language. Eventually, I returned to ministry. I was in Springfield, Illinois from 2001 to 2003, and still struggling with sobriety. And I can still remember Sunday afternoons. I would be driving home from church, and I'm a serious introvert. All the stimulation and all the stuff going on in the service and the coffee hour afterwards was just filling my mind up with noise. And so the only thing I could really think about driving home, even though I knew better, was, well, one small glass of sake or unblended scotch, because I was a very expensive drunk in those days. I thought just one glass and I'll feel a lot better. So I'd get home and I'd pour a glass and I would take this first sip. And my old Zen teacher used to say it was like nirvana, like, finally. Then my next thought would be, will I have enough before I need to go buy more? By June 14th, 2003, 17 years ago, I had my last drink, my last blackout, my last vomiting. I knew that if I continued, I would die. I again went to AA, and they saved my life. No judging. Another Unitarian Universalist helped. My partner Deborah in Oregon helped. And I turned away from alcohol. It was hard for a while, but I managed thanks to other people as well as myself. I went back into interim ministry after that, and I found out a very interesting dynamic in some of these Unitarian Universalist communities in other parts of the country, I won't say where it was very common practice to have bottles of wine at the board meeting or the finance committee. And I asked them, well, why do you do this? And well, because it's a social time. And I thought, I said, how would people feel if they saw people drinking at a finance committee? And they thought about it and they said, well, maybe we'll skip it for this year. And I said, okay, that's fine. And the other thing I kept hearing in congregations was, well, we're having a church auction in a couple of months. And what we really hope will happen is that people will drink a lot of alcohol and they'll bid higher. And on that one, I decided not to say anything, except I think it would be good to have some non-alcoholic alternatives at the auction as well. And they started doing that. Well, after I got sober in 2003, I found out there were no real resources out there, especially in the Unitarian Universalist world, about addiction and recovery. AA and 12-step model was about it. So in the UU world in 2004, I read a story about my colleague, late colleague, because he died several years ago, Dennis Meacham, who had started the first addiction ministry in the UUA. And his book, which I highly recommend, is the Addiction Ministry Handbook, and it came out that year. Few resources were available other than Dennis's book for any of us who might be religious skeptics, shall we say. I was invited later that year to help create an official UUA addictions ministry program with Dennis and others. We presented workshops at General Assembly and at various congregations, really up to this day. And I've been involved with that group, now called the Addictions and Recovery Ministry, since then. And I think Barbara Meyer, was she with you a few weeks ago, some time ago? Yeah, she's on that committee as well. But Dennis's book, because I'm going to resources now, was a major boost to having open discussions and actions about addiction and recovery, because again, it was nothing that we talked about in our congregations, it seemed. And that also includes mental illness. So I kept watching to see if other resources were coming out in that time. And it was really pretty amazing how many resources on addiction and recovery came out. I've mentioned some, I sent some to Jim and others in your fellowship regarding various resources, including one that I enjoy very much by a woman by the name of Charlotte Castle, K-A-S-L. She's a retired psychologist in Montana, and the book is called Many Roads, One Journey, Moving Beyond the 12 Steps. It's an excellent alternative to 12-step program models and how women were treated in altogether too many 12-step meetings, because there were a lot of predators in those groups. So I highly recommend her book. It's still in print. Later, I learned about SMART, which is an acronym, and I do not know what it stands for, but it's a successor to what was called rational recovery. It is a logic-based, rational-based program, again, with other people, to wean ourselves away from the tendency or desire to be addicted to substances or behaviors. But also in 2004, which turned out to be a pretty busy year, I heard of a new book called One Breath at a Time, Buddhism and the 12 Steps, by Buddhist teacher Kevin Griffin. And I was thrilled, because up to that time, I'd heard of no other books from the Buddhist community that talked about addiction and recovery, because my spiritual training and my background is primarily Buddhist. So I contacted Kevin, and he and his family live in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I asked him if he'd like to come up to Seattle, where I lived at the time, and do a workshop and lectures. So sure enough, we got it all arranged, and he came up, I think it was in October of 2004. And Kevin and I have been friends, and he's been essentially my teacher ever since then. And we've worked on a number of different projects. We're both involved with an organization called the Buddhist Recovery Network. I will state here, it is not recovering from Buddhism. It is using Buddhist teachings, the Dharma, to help people deal with addiction and recovery. And earlier I'd mentioned the fifth precept, not getting intoxicated. And there are plenty of Buddhists who get intoxicated all the time. We suffer from it as much as everyone else does. But the Buddhist Recovery Network, which is a worldwide organization, is focused on helping people recover without the sometimes difficult issues of the 12-step model with God, for example, or a theist God, and so on, because none of those are important in Buddhist teachings. It is not a theistic-based tradition. So we've been working with that ever since about 2008, and I'm on the board of the Buddhist Recovery Network now as we continue to add meetings around the world. And as an aside, I started one of the first ones in the Seattle area again in 2004, and we called it SIT Happens, S-I-T, Happens, and they still meet every week because I was in Seattle 2 years ago, and they're still going about 17 years later. Well, back to resources. Kevin has written a number of books since then, and his focus has been to look at the 12-step model, but from a Buddhist perspectives, but without the religious issues, the external judgment, or relying on a deity to solve our problems with addiction. And there's one particular book that I'm going to mention now as part of the question of higher power. What does that really mean? One of his books is called A Burning Desire, Dharma, God, and the Path of Recovery. AA meetings, as Jim mentioned, tend to see higher power as God, for example, in whatever way you may define God. It can be the meeting, it can be the group, but oftentimes tends to default towards the religious language and the Judeo-Christian Islamic traditions of a God, or what might some people would call a supernatural entity. That's a whole other issue. So many people, including myself, were very turned off with AA because of the 1930s Protestant white male religious model. And it is still very prevalent in AA meetings, although recently, in the last, again, 10 to 15 years, more programs are developing using the 12 steps, but not using the religious language. But still, it was a problem. It was a problem for me in terms of, what do I surrender to? I don't want to surrender to a deity. I don't want to surrender because I have character defects, and so on. I don't want to surrender to a higher power that I don't understand. So, being a good Unitarian Universalist, I finally figured it out. I redefined the term. Higher power can be many things. The community of recovering addicts. It can be a religious community like yours or mine. But in his book, what Kevin said was that higher power can mean many, many other things. For example, karma. Karma is not, at least in the tradition I follow, a result of fate. In other words, your fate karmically is to be an alcoholic. Not quite. In the Zen tradition, karma is simply the law of cause and effect. You do this, you think that, there are going to be consequences. Positive, negative, neutral. So Kevin mentions karma as being one of those higher powers. Whatever we do, speak, or say, or think, will have consequences. But it's not relying on anyone else. It's ours to own, along with the consequences. But the other thing he mentions in the book is the higher power of spiritual awakening. So what does that mean? I'm going to define the terms here, for me anyway. Spiritual, relationship. Relationship to you, relationship to here in Meadville, relationship with everything. And when I was drinking, my whole relationship to the world was that glass of alcohol. Nothing else mattered. I was fortunate in that I had a nearly fatal accident in late 2003, and I was on opiates for about a year, and I never really got interested in them addictively. So alcohol has always been my addiction, if you will, of choice. So my relationship to the world at that time of my life was that glass, and the worry that I would not have enough to last the entire day. So spiritual is relationship. Awakening. We see awakening as awareness or understanding the results, the karma, of our thoughts, words, and deeds. So awareness of, if I say this, what are the consequences going to be? If I think this, how is it going to make me feel emotionally? If I do this, how will it affect myself and other people? And so awakening as well, awareness is awareness, and being able to step back, say before I took that drink, and say, not today, not now. And that's what I've now practiced for 17 years. Now, someone here at the church asked me recently, how would I define higher power? Because we were talking about addiction, or God. And I said, well, what about the seventh principle? The interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. Nothing is left out. No one is left out. It includes everything, everything in the universe. And I thought, well, maybe that's as good a definition of God or higher power as I can imagine. What awakening does is makes us more aware of our actions and our consequences. We cannot cut ourselves off from that interdependent web of all existence. We will always affect others as well as ourselves. So I tend to see higher power now as relationship. And the more I'm aware of relationship, the more I can step back and say, I'm not going to do something harmful. Last thought. Carl Jung, when he was communicating with Bill Wilson back in, or I think it was early 1961 or so, shortly before they both died, actually, Carl Jung was talking also not just about awakening and craving, but he mentioned to Bill Wilson in one of his letters, you know, if he said it nicely, religious components of the 12 steps as they exist were removed, the 12-step model would be an archetypal path to wholeness or to awakening, universally as an archetype. And ever since then, I have been thinking, and I've talked to Kevin and other people in the Buddhist community about this, what would that look like? What would it look like if we had an archetypal path to wholeness or awakening or to health, if you will? And it wasn't dependent on a particular religious tradition. So that's what I want to leave you with for right now, because I think that it gives us an opportunity to explore what is awakening, or if you will, what is salvation, or if you will, what is awareness, and how do we grow? So something to think about. So thank you so very much, and I look forward to chatting a little bit later.